On a bright morning, the mayor of the state, dressed sharply in his signature blue suit, decided to take a walk to a community meeting in the park. He had always prided himself on being accessible to his constituents, walking among them to hear their concerns firsthand. It was part of his commitment to staying grounded and connected to the people who had elected him. The park was bustling with families enjoying the sunshine, children playing, and neighbors chatting. He smiled as he walked past familiar faces, exchanging greetings with those who recognized him. However, across the park, a young, overzealous officer was on patrol. The officer, new to the force and eager to assert his authority, noticed the mayor walking alone. Fueled by implicit bias, he mistook the well-dressed black man for someone who didn't belong. The officer's gaze hardened as he observed the mayor's calm, composed demeanor. His mind raced with assumptions. He thought the mayor looked out of place, perhaps up to no good. Without a word of greeting or even a polite inquiry, the officer approached the mayor. "Hey, what are you doing here?" the officer demanded aggressively, his voice sharp. The mayor, taken aback by the sudden confrontation, tried to remain calm. "I'm on my way to a community meeting," he explained politely. "I'm the mayor of this state, and I'm just walking through the park to engage with the people." The officer, however, wasn't having it. He crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes. "Sure you are," he sneered, not believing a word the mayor said. "I've seen people like you before. What are you really up to?" The officer didn't ask for identification or offer the mayor any opportunity to explain himself further. Instead, he reached out and grabbed the mayor's arm, yanking it behind his back. "Hey, what are you doing?" the mayor asked, his voice steady, but with a hint of confusion. "You can't do this. I'm the mayor." The officer, stubborn and filled with unchecked prejudice, continued his actions. "I've had enough of this nonsense," he muttered under his breath. Pushing the mayor's hands into handcuffs, the mayor's calm demeanor remained, but a sense of disbelief was beginning to creep in. He never expected something like this to happen, especially in a place where he had always felt safe among his people. As the officer escorted the mayor, who remained unfazed, toward a nearby squad car, a crowd of onlookers began to gather. Phones were pulled out, and the scene quickly became viral, with people watching in shock as the officer unjustly arrested the state's mayor. The mayor remained composed, knowing the incident would have serious consequences. However, at that moment, he couldn't help but wonder how this was even possible. How had he, a public servant, become the target of such blatant racism? The answers would soon unfold, but for now, the reality of the situation was becoming undeniable. At the police station, the young officer, still convinced that he had done his job right, led the mayor through the narrow, sterile hallways of the precinct. The mayor remained silent, his expression calm, but his mind was racing. It wasn't just the humiliation of the arrest that troubled him. It was the realization of how deeply ingrained racism had shaped this situation. The officer hadn't even bothered to ask for his ID or check his identity. He had simply assumed that a black man walking through the park in a blue suit must have been up to something nefarious. The officers at the station processed the mayor without hesitation, their actions routine and devoid of any real concern. No one questioned the arresting officer's claims. The mayor's quiet demeanor seemed to only encourage their assumptions, making it easier for them to dismiss his attempts to assert his identity. As the mayor stood there, his hands cuffed behind his back, he could feel the weight of the injustice settling around him. He had been a public servant for years, always working to create a fairer world for people who looked like him. And yet, here he was, trapped in a system that allowed ignorance and prejudice to dictate the course of his life. Minutes passed, each one dragging on longer than the last. The officers processed the mayor's information with the same indifference they would for any other individual brought in under suspicion. The mayor, his mind still processing the absurdity of it all, observed the proceedings with quiet focus. He didn't show anger, but the disbelief was palpable in the tension of his body. Just as the officer who arrested him was about to leave the processing room, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the station. The door swung open, and a woman stormed in, accompanied by several other individuals, all of them wearing suits and carrying important-looking documents. The woman at the forefront was the mayor's assistant, her face flushed with frustration but also determination. Her eyes scanned the room, and as soon as she saw the mayor, her features softened with relief. "Release him, immediately," she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence in the room. "Do you have any idea who you've arrested?" The officers paused, glancing at each other, clearly confused. The arresting officer stood stiffly, unsure of what was happening. The assistant, now standing by the mayor's side, placed the documents on the desk. They were the mayor's credentials, his identification, and various government seals verifying his position as the highest-ranking official in the state. "I'm sorry," the station chief finally muttered, his face growing pale as the realization hit him. This can't be right." "Right," the mayor's assistant replied sharply. "You've just unlawfully arrested the state's mayor. Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in right now?" The room fell into stunned silence as the officers began to process the gravity of the situation. The station chief turned toward the young officer, who looked as if he might sink into the floor in embarrassment. The assistant, with the entourage of staff behind her, continued to speak firmly. "We will be filing a formal complaint against the department for this. Your actions have not only been unlawful, but they are also a clear demonstration of racial profiling and prejudice." The station chief, now visibly shaken, nodded and looked at the mayor, his eyes filled with remorse. "Mr. Mayor, he began, but the mayor cut him off, still composed despite the injustice he had endured. "It's all right," the mayor said quietly. "I understand the situation now. You may not have been personally responsible, but this is a failure of the entire system." The young officer, standing by awkwardly, shifted his weight and seemed unable to meet the mayor's gaze. The reality of his mistake was setting in, but there was no way to undo the damage done. The assistant, still furious, directed the officers to release the mayor immediately and inform the press about the incident. The assistant's words were sharp, and the sense of urgency in her voice made it clear that this was not just about the mayor. This was a public matter that would demand accountability from the entire police department. As the mayor was finally uncuffed, he stood tall, not allowing his posture to betray any sense of defeat. He nodded toward his assistant, signaling that they could leave, but before he did, he turned to the young officer who had started this entire ordeal. "I hope you learned something from this. It's not about authority, it's about respect, and everyone deserves that." With those words, the mayor exited the station, his assistant and staff following close behind. As the door shut behind them, the officer who had made the arrest remained rooted to the spot, his face now flushed with guilt. It would take time for him to understand the gravity of his actions, but for now the damage had been done, and it would take more than an apology to make things right. As the mayor left the precinct, the reality of the incident began to hit home. What had happened to him was not just an isolated case, it was a symptom of a much larger issue, and it was one that he would not rest until he addressed. The police chief, visibly flustered and uncomfortable, stood in front of the mayor and his assistant, trying to salvage the situation. His attempt to downplay the incident fell flat. "Mr. Mayor, I truly apologize for the confusion," the chief said, his voice shaky. "It was just a misunderstanding, an unfortunate lapse in judgment. I assure you, it won't happen again." But the mayor, standing tall with his arms crossed, didn't buy the apology. He had heard too many such apologies in his career, always offered in the wake of a wrong that had yet to be truly addressed. This was no simple misunderstanding. This was a clear case of racial profiling, and he wasn't about to let it go without confronting it head-on. "No," the mayor responded, his voice firm and calm, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "This isn't just about a mistake. It's about a system that allows people to be treated differently, based on the color of their skin. And it's about you allowing an officer with such biases to remain on duty without oversight." The chief swallowed hard, unable to meet the mayor's gaze. "We'll review the situation," he said. But it was clear he was only trying to placate the mayor. The damage had already been done. The mayor was not interested in a review, he wanted action. "I don't want a review. I want accountability," the mayor insisted. The arresting officer, who had been standing to the side, clearly uncomfortable, now visibly shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Realization had begun to sink in, and the full gravity of his mistake was becoming painfully clear. As the mayor's identity became apparent to him, the officer's face turned crimson. He had not only arrested a high-ranking official, but had done so in an embarrassingly ignorant manner. The officer fumbled as he tried to apologize, stammering, "Mr. Mayor, I didn't know who you were, But the words failed him. The mayor raised his hand, cutting him off, his tone more resolute than before. "Your actions speak louder than your words," the mayor said calmly, looking the officer directly in the eye. "And your actions were rooted in something much deeper than ignorance. You saw a black man and assumed he didn't belong. I've dealt with this my entire life, and so have so many others. But no more." The officer's face reddened further, and he could do nothing but stand in silence, fully aware that nothing he said would erase the weight of his behavior. The mayor's assistant, standing next to him, nodded in agreement, her voice cold as she added, "You've not just wronged the mayor. You've wronged every citizen in this city who has ever faced this kind of treatment." The mayor turned back to the chief, who now appeared to be grasping for some semblance of control over the situation. "I'm ordering an immediate internal investigation into biased policing practices," the mayor declared. "I don't care how long it takes. I want to see real change, and I want this department reformed to ensure that something like this never happens again." The chief nodded, but his expression was filled with resignation. He knew that the mayor meant every word he said, and the police department would not come out of this unscathed. The mayor's assistant took out her phone and began drafting a statement. "I'm also calling for an independent review of this officer's conduct. This goes beyond what's acceptable in law enforcement," she said, her voice clipped and authoritative. The officer, still standing there in stunned silence, could hardly look anyone in the eye. The mayor's words had struck hard. The mayor was not just a figurehead. He was a man of principle, someone who would not rest until justice was done. This moment was a stark reminder that the fight for equality was far from over. As the mayor and his assistant left the station, the mayor addressed his assistant. "This isn't just about one officer or one mistake. We've been fighting these kinds of issues for decades. We need to make sure we don't just address this incident. We need to ensure systemic changes are made." The assistant nodded, fully in agreement. "This incident is going to be a turning point," she said. "We'll make sure of it." Back at the station, the officer stood motionless as the chief began issuing directives to start the internal review. The entire department would be under the microscope, and the officer knew the scrutiny would not end with him. The mayor's words had already made it clear this wasn't just about him. It was about the broader issue of racial profiling that had plagued society for too long. And so, the investigation began. The mayor's decision to act swiftly and decisively sent shockwaves through the department. This was no longer just about one officer's failure. It was about the need for accountability and systemic reform within the institution. For the young officer, this moment would be a life-altering lesson. He would not only have to face disciplinary action for his role in the incident, but he would also have to confront his own biases, learn from his mistakes, and undergo the kind of training that should have been mandated in the first place. The mayor's resolve was clear. As he walked away from the precinct, the weight of the situation settled over him. He knew that true justice would only be achieved when systemic change happened. But this was a start. This was the moment when the city would begin to change, one action at a time. The incident quickly became national news, with reporters from across the country covering the shocking arrest of the mayor. The story sparked heated discussions about racial profiling, police misconduct, and the treatment of minorities by law enforcement. As the details of the arrest and the mayor's calm composure spread, many citizens expressed their admiration for the mayor's grace and strength in handling the situation. His refusal to allow the officer's prejudice to define the moment resonated with people from all walks of life, and they praised his unwavering stance on justice. Social media exploded with support for the mayor. Hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #Accountability for police flooded platforms, and citizens shared their own stories of racial profiling and mistreatment by law enforcement. For many, the mayor's actions were seen as a beacon of hope in the ongoing fight for equality. Across the country, people rallied behind the mayor, demanding that systemic change take place not just in his city, but in communities everywhere. In the days following the incident, the mayor addressed the public, reaffirming his commitment to addressing racial bias in law enforcement. He explained that the arrest was an unfortunate reminder of how deeply ingrained prejudice could be within institutions, even in the most unsuspecting circumstances. The mayor made it clear that he would not allow the actions of one officer to reflect on the city as a whole, but he emphasized that this was a wake-up call for the need to tackle systemic issues head-on. To ensure lasting change, the mayor worked closely with local community leaders, activists, and law enforcement professionals to create new, comprehensive training programs for officers. These programs were designed to address not only racial bias, but also to promote better communication, de-escalation techniques, and conflict resolution skills. The mayor's office also implemented more stringent measures for reporting and addressing incidents of racial profiling. The new policies mandated that officers undergo routine psychological evaluations and that they be held accountable for their actions, regardless of their rank or tenure. Additionally, the mayor introduced a public-facing review board that would oversee complaints against officers and ensure that the voices of community members were heard. This board would also track police conduct and offer transparency to the public, fostering trust between law enforcement and the people they served. These steps were all aimed at creating a safer environment for everyone, with particular emphasis on protecting marginalized communities who had historically been targeted by law enforcement. The city's residents were cautiously optimistic as they saw these changes taking shape. The mayor's leadership had made a profound impact, and many felt that the incident, while painful, would be a catalyst for much-needed reform. There were still skeptics who believed that real change would take longer, but the mayor's swift action and firm stance against discrimination sent a clear message. The city was committed to becoming a model for progressive policing and creating a future where everyone, regardless of race, was treated with respect and dignity. The mayor's office also worked to establish partnerships with national civil rights organizations and law enforcement oversight groups. These partnerships ensured that the reforms being put into place were in line with best practices and that the city remained on the right path toward equality. In time, the city became a beacon for other municipalities across the country who looked to its success in transforming the police department as a template for their own reform efforts. While the incident had left a stain on the city's reputation, it had also sparked a movement. Through his actions, the mayor had proven that leadership meant more than just making speeches. It was about making difficult decisions, taking responsibility, and standing up for justice, even in the face of adversity. The reforms he implemented would not only change the future of law enforcement in the city, but would also create a ripple effect that would reach far beyond its borders. The officer involved in the incident faced disciplinary action, including mandatory training on racial bias and sensitivity, and would eventually be reassigned to a different division. However, the real legacy of the mayor's actions lay not in punishing the officer, but in ensuring that future generations of officers would receive the training and education needed to foster true equality. The city had taken its first steps toward a brighter future, where people were judged not by the color of their skin, but by their character. As the weeks passed, the national conversation about police reform continued to grow. The mayor's response to the incident became a case study in how to handle racial bias in law enforcement. It sparked debates in city halls, community centers, and college campuses about what could be done to address the long-standing issue of racial profiling and police brutality. While there was still much work to be done, the aftermath of the mayor's arrest served as a reminder that leadership, accountability, and a commitment to justice could make a difference. The mayor's determination to hold the officer accountable for his actions, while simultaneously taking action to reform the system, was a powerful example of what could be achieved when people chose to fight for what was right. The city's journey was just beginning, but thanks to the mayor's vision and courage, the path to meaningful change was now clear.